The British Museum's collection of prints and drawings is one of the most important in the world. We've got a wonderful collection of drawings going back to the early Renaissance, to the beginnings of paper in Europe. The 19th century collections of the British Museum are very, very strong because, of course, that's the period when the museum was building up its collections. And the Dalziels fit into this whole huge expansion of the print trade in the 19th century. Lots of technological developments in printmaking, as in every other area of trade and manufacture. The Dalziels were incredibly important as really commercial printmakers and print publishers on a huge scale. The museum didn't have any of their work until the very end of the Dalziel family's career. I've got the report to the trustees of that period when they arrived in April 1913, and Campbell Dodgson, who was then the keeper, explains how they'd been negotiating with Gilbert Dalziel for 2 years, but they'd already spent a lot of money on purchasing another big collection 2 years ago, so they had to sort of wait and save up for this one. Fortunately, Mr. Dalziel reduced the price from £300 to £275, which was a lot of money, but the museum managed to cough up. And he lists exactly how important they are, how they're, as he says, masterpieces of the 1860s, such as Dalziel's Bible Gallery, Millet's Parables, etc., but also a lot of what he calls merely commercial work. But of course, nowadays we find that commercial work just as interesting, really, as the fine art productions, because they really show the context for that material, and they show the way the print trade worked, that art wasn't entirely separate from commerce. We've had these prints since 1913, and they were all listed when they arrived and properly registered, of course. Everything's stamped with its British Museum number, but nobody's done any thorough investigation. The collection is so huge, over 50,000 proofs, and people have come in to look at various aspects of the collection corresponding with their interests, usually in the fine art parts of the collection. But we were really delighted when Bethan Stevens suggested that she might develop a project to look at the collection as a whole.
I've been interested in wood engraving for a long time. I'm passionate about the medium. And first of all, I became interested in William Blake's wood engravings. And then I became very interested in pre-Raphaelite wood engraving, and more broadly in what was happening to wood engraving in the Victorian period, which was the height of the medium, and it became really incredibly important at that time. And the Dalziels were the largest firm producing wood engravings in Britain in the 19th century. So they're just an incredibly exciting group of people to work with. The Dalziels were a very large family, 12 children, and more than half of them artists. And George Dalziel came down to London from Newcastle in 1835 to be apprenticed as a wood engraver. And gradually various brothers and sisters joined him. So the main members of the Dalziel brothers, the wood engraving firm, were George and his brother Edward, and later in 1860 Thomas Dalziel joined them. George and Edward wrote a really fascinating autobiography which they published in 1901, and which is the only book really that has been written about the Dalziels. One of the figures I'm particularly interested in is Margaret Dalziel, their sister, and they have just 3 or 4 sentences on Margaret, and they're really fascinating sentences because they suggest in a way that she did both everything and nothing, that she helped out with absolutely all aspects of the business for 4 decades. And they kind of say that in 3 sentences and then leave it. So I'm really interested in her role and in how, although undocumented, it's a very important one. And I think looking at this family photograph that we have here in the museum, it's really fascinating. This particular photograph, it's a picture of Margaret Dalziel in the centre, so occupying a structurally important role in the family and in this representation of the family. And around her, various other members, including George Dalziel, Edward Dalziel and Thomas Dalziel. So she's sort of like the centre around which the business is kind of orbiting, if you like. So the Dalziel archive is a really phenomenal collection. There are over 54,000 prints in this collection, spanning 1839 to 1893. And for the most part, these are collected annually in albums, one album per year, made by the Dalziel family as the prints were produced. So it's an amazing record, kind of year by year, of exactly, you know, everything that was coming out of the workshop. 54,000 is a lot of prints, and this reflects really the incredible burgeoning market for book illustration in the 19th century. Wood engraving as a medium was invented in the early 19th century. Buick is often credited with its invention. And it was very different from woodcuts, which had been around for centuries. Wood engraving is actually cut on the end grain of the wood instead of on the plank, and it's usually on boxwood. And that means that much finer detail was possible. And you can see incredibly, unbelievably fine lines sometimes, which are very hard to appreciate in digital reproductions. One of the reasons I chose this volume, it's because it's the one where we have the engravers proofs for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which was one of the important books that the Dalziels engraved. And I suppose that's interesting to me for several reasons. One of them is that this book gets associated with the name of John Tenniel as an illustrator. And John Tenniel made the designs for the book, but the Dalziels actually engraved those designs on wood. And wood engraving in the 19th century, when it became a big kind of capitalist business, was a kind of radically collaborative medium. And I think partly for marketing purposes at the time, people were keen to kind of push the name of one particular illustrator, often famous illustrators like John Tenniel, like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais. And in that sense, the Dalziels were kind of happy to promote the name of other artists, and their own name became kind of less well known and less important, although people had heard of them in the Victorian period very much. But yeah, I'm kind of interested in the fact that most people know these illustrations, but very few people associate them with the name of the people who actually made them.